Greetings and welcome. This is episode 18 of the Australia-China Media Watch podcast. In this week, running from Monday the 14th of March to Sunday the 20th of March 2022, there were 20 articles in the Global Times mentioning Australia. And in contrast, there were also 20 mentions of China from Sky News Australia. Over the past few weeks, the differences were in multiples of 2 to 3 in favor of the Global Times mentioning Australia, and this is the first time I've seen a tie between these two news sources since I began this podcast in November 2021. So this is going to be a long podcast. Let's unpack and take a closer look at the headlines from these two sources. From the Global Times, published 15th of March, clinical trials for 2 COVID-19 small molecule drugs to kick off this year, according to Chinese scientists. Published on the 15th of March as well, Project CIA. This is followed by 23rd Biennale of Sydney held in Australia, published on the 15th of March. Originally published by the AFP, this next article has the headline, Aussie Court Strikes Down Landmark Climate Ruling. This is followed up by an article from the 16th of March, found in the Viewpoint column. The headline reads, American elites clamor to sanction India as they are not used to the world saying no to US. Also published on the 16th of March, Australia's reckless decoupling push harms global supply chain. Published on the 16th of March as well, opening of the borders. And this is followed up with, I'm hoping I'm getting the pronunciation of this correct, Meet Methusela, the world's oldest living aquarium fish in the US. Published on the 17th of March, 5 mysteries. Why is the US neglected in the global origins tracing of COVID-19? Published on the 17th of March, US ready to fight to the last drop of Ukrainian European blood, according to a former UK MP. On the 18th of March, this headline reads, GT investigates China's zero COVID policy, flexible measures ensure minimum impact on supply chains. In an article directed at Australia, this next headline reads, Human rights violations against Indigenous people in the US, Canada and Australia, published March 18th. And also published on the March 18th, Canberra Balloon Spectacular Festival. Another article directed towards Australia, Morrison clamours for China sanctions, but ignores abomination of Australia. Another one that's directed towards Australia, Australians celebrate the 90th anniversary of iconic Sydney Harbour Bridge, published March 19th. Directed towards Australia, US, Canada, Australia advised to reflect on wrongdoings, violations of Indigenous people's rights at side event of UN Human Rights Council. Published on March 19th, Australia is mentioned indirectly here, and this headline reads, US-led Western sanctions rally successful to backfire eventually. Published on the 20th of March, Australia is mentioned indirectly. In this article, the headline, Lobbyist Kishida fails to sway India on Ukraine during visit. Published on the 20th of March, directed at Australia, The headline reads, Liberal Party suffers shock defeat in South Australia ahead of national polls. The final article for the week mentioning Australia is this headline. Top Australian scientists commit to plastic waste reduction initiative. We'll move over to have a closer look at the headlines from Sky News Australia. We begin with Russia requests military aid from China. Too many downsides for China to become aligned with Russia in Ukraine. Russia asking China for military help is as serious as it gets. US warns China against supporting Russia. Australia should be doing much more to reduce dependency on China. Careful approach required for China sanctions. Following up from that, fears China may provide military or economic support to Russia. This is followed up by United States deeply concerned with Russia and China ties. And Sky News Australia is being pretty relentless over here with many of these articles appearing on the same day. This next headline reads, Russia pressing China to provide active support in military action against Ukraine. Following up from that, China made a huge mistake by not condemning Russia's invasion. NATO's direct message to China as fears grow of Russian chemical weapons attack. China dismisses Western criticism over zero COVID response as cases soar. From Prime Minister Scott Morrison, chilling silence from China is of great concern. China slammed for chilling silence over Russia's invasion. Ex-ambassador to China says Beijing made a huge, historic mistake. This is followed up by World will judge China for not taking action against Russia, published on March 17th. Global supply chains could be affected amid China COVID outbreak, also published on March 17th. And this is followed up by Taiwan's foreign minister says China wants to change the international order, appearing on the 17th of March as well. We have next Biden to send clear message to China in phone call with Xi, appearing on the March 18th. And this is followed up by the final article for the week, the 20th article from Sky News Australia with a mention of China, is this headline. China reports first COVID-19 death in a year. And this appeared on March 20th, 2022 at 6:44 p.m. And this concludes our look at the headlines from these two news sources for the week, starting from 14th of March, Monday, to Sunday, the 20th of March. So the frequency of mentions of China from Sky News Australia is at a high that I've not seen for approximately 2 months. For the last few weeks, we're looking at 26 to 7, Global Times 26, Sky News 7, dating from 7th to 13th of February. From 14th to 20th of February, it was 19 to 10. From 21st of February to the 27th, it was 22 to 9. 28th February to 6th March, 19 to 2. 7th March to 13th of March, 13 to 5. And this time around, 20 to 20. Please stick around if you'd like to find out more about a more nuanced unpacking of each of the articles. Here's the first article from the Global Times. Published on the 15th of March 2020, this headline reads, Clinical trials for 2 COVID-19 small molecule drugs to kick off this year, according to Chinese scientists. This is found in the China Society section and written by Leng Shumei. It's accompanied with an image of a lab, and the opening paragraph reads, Global Health Drug Institute, Discovery Institute, the GHDDI, is expected to start clinical trials for 2 COVID-19 candidate drugs this year as Omicron strikes Chinese cities, making it more urgent to create effective and convenient oral treatments to better tackle the variant. Australia is mentioned once in the article. It appears here, and the paragraph reads, Another candidate developed by the team led by Ding is an inhaled broad-spectrum antiviral small molecule. Studies on healthy volunteers in Australia are expected to kick off in late March or April this year. Based on this initial impression, I would think Australia is represented in a neutral manner. We'll move along to the next article. Published also on March 15th by the Global Times staff reporters, found in the in-depth section. This headline reads, US covertly experiments mind control on people across continents for decades, no official apology, with the subheader Project CIA. The opening paragraph reads, They've taken away enough from me. I don't remember my birth name. I'm not in contact with my children. It's a very degrading, devastating reality, said 72-year-old Mariam Ruhula, an MK Ultra victim who now lives in Grand Prairie, Texas. MK Ultra is the code name of a human experimentation program designed and undertaken by the US and its notorious spy agency, the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA. It started on April 13th, 1953, and lasted for 20 years. It was the height of the Cold War, and the US designed covert operation, among which was MK Ultra, aimed at developing tools that could be used against Soviet bloc enemies to control human behavior with drugs and other psychological manipulators. Psychedelic drugs, paralytics, and electroshock therapy, all heinous and inhumane techniques, were clandestinely but routinely used on humans. They included citizens from the US and other countries who were unwitting test subjects, and encapsulation of immense human rights violations. From the opening few paragraphs of this article, what the article is trying to do is to paint, to represent, to construct the US as a repulsive other, undertaking such immense human rights violations. Australia is mentioned a number of times in the article. Here, here, and here. So 4 times, and it starts with this paragraph. The CIA mind control schemes did not just remain on US soil, but were extended to US allies including Denmark, Australia, and Canada. Beyond that, it's also mentioned here. According to Australian media reports, the US once took the experiments to Australia in the 1960s that involved Sydney University psychology students. What took place in the Danish documentary and Australian media reports was just the tip of the iceberg. Between 1950 and 1964, experiments funded by the Canadian government and covertly in part by the CIA as part of MK Ultra were conducted at the Ellen Memorial Institute of McGill University in Canada. And the concluding paragraph of this article reads, Ruhula said that she hopes the world will remember the immense suffering of MKUltra victims by setting aside a special day. I know after apartheid they had a reconciliation council. We don't have anything like that, be it MKUltra, be it slavery, be it the genocide of the Native Americans, in order for the individuals in the country to heal. There needs to be an acknowledgement, there needs to be apologies, there needs to be compensation, and there needs to be genuine reconciliation, said Ruhula. Based on this initial impression, Australia is arguably represented and constructed in a negative manner, supportive of such a seemingly repulsive behavior from the US. Move along to the next article. This is entitled The 23rd Biennale of Sydney held in Australia, and it's published originally by Xinhua on March the 15th, 2020. It belongs to the photo/world section of the Global Times. We have a number of images here, 1, 2, 3, and 4. And they come with the following captions. Starting with the first image, people visit Biennale of Sydney Revis at Art Gallery of New South Wales in Sydney, Australia on March 13th. The 23rd Biennale of Sydney is held from March 12th to March 13th, with more than 330 artworks by over 80 participants presented during the event. Here you have the second caption. A woman visits the Biennale of Sydney. And it looks like the captions for the remaining images are copies of each other. Based on this initial impression, I think Australia is represented in a somewhat positive manner. We'll move along to the next article. Published originally by the AFP. This is the headline: Aussie Court Strikes Down Landmark Climate Ruling, found in the World Asia Pacific section of the Global Times. It comes with an accompanying image, a photograph with the following captions. People walk in front of Sydney Opera House in Sydney, Australia on October 11th, 2021. The opening paragraph reads, an Australian court on Tuesday ruled that the country's Environment Minister does not have a duty to protect children from the harms of climate change, overturning a landmark ruling. A group of high school students had argued Australia's Environment Minister, Susan Ley, must weigh the harm that climate change will inflict on children when approving new fossil fuel projects. In July 2020, a judge agreed with the students, finding the minister must avoid causing personal injury or death to under 18s due to emissions of carbon dioxide into the Earth's atmosphere. But the Environment Minister soon appealed that watershed ruling. On Tuesday, Australia's federal court sided with the minister, in part because of the tiny increase in risk from the coal mine at the centre of the case, Whitehaven's Vickery coal mine. Anjali Sharma said the ruling had left her and fellow students devastated. 2 years ago, Australia was on fire, it's underwater. Burning coal makes bushfires and floods more catastrophic and more deadly. Something needs to change. Australia is mentioned a number of times in the article. And it's also found in the concluding paragraphs. And they read, the students' lawyers will consider whether to appeal the case to Australia's highest court. And the Australian government did not immediately respond to a request for comment. Based on this initial impression, one may just make the argument that Australia is not exactly represented in a positive light, and one that is much more negative in nature. We'll move along to the next piece. Published on the 16th of March, this headline reads, American elites clamor to sanction India as they are not used to the world, saying no to the US. It's found in the opinion/viewpoint section of the Global Times, and it comes with an accompanying image illustrated by Chen Xia. And the opening paragraph of the article reads, "The news that India may accept a Russian offer to buy crude oil and other commodities at discounted prices with payment via a rupee-ruble transaction has obviously irritated some US and European experts who condemned the move. The US government should sanction India, according to Fox Business Network anchor Trish Regan in a tweet on Tuesday, warning that US sanctions would devastate the Indian economy. On Wednesday, CNBC quoted White House Press Secretary Jan Psaki as warning India, "Think about where you want to stand when history books are written at this moment in time." The following paragraph reads, "The American elites are not yet used to the world turning against the US, but they will become more accustomed. It wants global support to sanction and suppress Russia, but each country has its own agenda and own history and situation, as well as a different historical entanglement with the US and Russia." Reagan tweeted, "You are with us or you are against us," drawing a line in the sand, a clear case of othering in play. These words were famously spoken by George W. Bush before the US launched its war on terror in 2001. Does Reagan believe the US retains the kind of mobilization power it had 20 years ago? Since then, US influence to rally and mobilize other nations has greatly waned. Only its little brothers would still listen to its command. A very telling paragraph on its impression on the kind of power projection the US is capable of today, and a sneaky little jab at its little brothers. Could that be a subtle reference to Australia and Japan? Australia appears here in the third paragraph, and it reads, "Americans like Reagan probably forget that unlike Japan and Australia, which are formal treaty allies of the US, India is just a strategic partner with no treaty obligations or security commitments in ties with the US. This means that India has more capabilities to ignore the will of the US. At least when it comes to national sovereignty, India has more capabilities and will to determine its own national destiny than those pawns of the US." So really building up this assertion that, yep, the US may have its little brothers, the US may have these pawns, but India is a different proposition altogether. Australia is mentioned once in the entire article, which I've just read out, and let's have a closer look at the concluding paragraphs. Sanctions backfire in today's world. The more the US imposes sanctions on other countries, the more they will weaken the US itself. Even the US won't completely sanction Russia, as it would be putting its own economy at risk. India and US allies in NATO will consider their own interests in terms of energy and economics. The article was compiled by the Global Times reporter based on an interview with Qing Yun, an expert on China-US relations based in Shanghai. From this impression, I think it's fair to say Australia is not exactly represented in a positive manner, but one that is negative and repulsive. Moving along to the next article, published on March the 16th, with the following headline: "Australia's reckless decoupling push harms global supply chain," written by Hui Qing and found in the source/economy section of the Global Times. It comes with an accompanying illustration by Tang Tengfei of a kangaroo looking exasperated, pouring water into a pot of what looks like a dying plant. And pretty interesting, instead of having leaves as you expect with a plant, it looks like it's a dying tree or some kind of plant that sheds cold? Cold? I'm not sure. Well, let's continue to unpack this. Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison on Wednesday announced $243 million worth of funding for rare earths refining projects in Australia during one of his election campaign events. Foreign media reports noted it as an effort of Australia working with the US to diversify sources of the important minerals away from China. While Australia had some of the world's largest reserves of rare earths, China is home to 70-80% of the industry globally, Bloomberg said. Citing Australian Industry, Energy and Emissions Reduction Minister Angus Taylor, this initiative is designed to address China's dominance. Australia is mentioned a total of 13 times in the article. There, and all the way through towards the end, 13 times. And let's begin unpacking by taking a closer look at the next paragraph. It's not breaking news, as the US government, often taking a zero-sum approach, has been roping in its allies to lead a so-called decoupling campaign against China. So kind of positioning the US approach as the opposite of what they'll do, which is to try and induce a win-win situation. In the case of the US government, representing their posture as one of taking on a zero-sum game approach. The next line reads, rare earths supply chain is a key focus in the eyes of the US and Australia because rare earths are important materials for a wide range of manufacturing use, including semiconductors and high technology weapons. Australia is mentioned again in this paragraph, and it reads, according to data by 2018, Australia recorded rare earths reserves of 3.4 million tons, accounting for only 2.83% of global reserves. By contrast, China's advantages go beyond affluent reserves. It ranks first in rare earth production, consumption and export. In terms of reserves, China's rare earth accounted for 36.7% of the world's total reserves. So in contrast, Australia with 2.83% and China with 36.7% of the world's total reserves, according to a paper published by the Chinese Society of Rare Earths. Australia is mentioned again in this paragraph, and it reads, such a large market demand is supporting the continuous growth of China's rare earths industry, which in turn will facilitate the advancement of the nation's high-tech innovations. Beyond this virtuous circle is the country's world-class manufacturing capabilities, an area in which the US and Australia fall short. Under such circumstances, China's rare earth industry will remain a top player for a long time to come. In the final paragraph, Australia is mentioned again. The US and Australia should get rid of their zero-sum mentality, a clear case of othering taking place over here. And beyond that, it goes on to stress and quit confronting China or decoupling from China's economy. Only through promoting cooperation in accordance with international rules and economic laws can benefit all parties, and that is the retort. The author is an editor with the Global Times. Based on this impression, I think it's pretty clear Australia is represented and constructed in a negative manner, placing them on the other side of the line. Moving along to the next article, and this one too is published on the 16th of March with the following headline, Opening Borders. It's found in the Photo/World section of the Global Times and published by and written by VCG. Photograph provided rather by the VCG. So this is a photo story, and the image comes with following captions. Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern looks on while Stuart Nash speaks during a press conference at Parliament in Wellington, New Zealand on March 16th, 2022. New Zealand's border will open to fully vaccinated tourists from Australia from 11:59 p.m. on April the 12th. Based on this initial impression, I think it's fair to say that Australia is represented in a neutral manner. We'll move along to the next piece. Published on the 16th of March as well. This is a photo story entitled Meet Methuselah, the world's oldest living aquarium fish in the US. It's accompanied with an image of Methuselah, the world's oldest living aquarium fish, at California Academy of Sciences, San Francisco, taken on March the 14th, 2022. The opening paragraph of the article reads, Meet Methuselah, an Australian lungfish thought to be the world's oldest living aquarium fish. The fish, which likes to eat fresh figs, was brought to the San Francisco Museum in 1938 from Australia. It's about 90 years old with no known living peers. The fish is a primitive species and is considered the evolutionary link between fish and amphibians. The article is accompanied with a number of images of Methuselah. And based on this initial impression, I think it's fair to say Australia is represented in a neutral manner. There are two mentions of Australia in the article, and they all appear in the accompanying text. We'll move along to the next article. Published on the 17th of March. This comes from the opinion/viewpoint section, and it has the following headline. 5 mysteries. Why is the US neglected in the global origins tracing of COVID-19? Written by Su Xiaohu. Published March 17th, 2022 at 10:43 p.m. The article is accompanied with an illustration by Liu Rui entitled Origins Tracing. The opening paragraph of the article reads, in late December 2019, Wuhan, capital city of the Hubei province of China, was the first to report a pneumonia never seen before that spread rapidly locally. Before that, an unexplained pneumonia, which is also rare, broke out swiftly in the US. Over the past 2 years, there have been many different theories and assumptions on the origins of the COVID-19 pandemic. The connection between the two bizarre outbreaks in China and the US remains a mystery. What is puzzling is that the World Health Organization, which has always taken a neutral stance, has adopted a completely different attitude towards China and the US. On one hand, the WHO has sent international experts to China twice to carry out origins tracing joint studies. On the other hand, the organization has repeatedly turned a blind eye to the US, where new evidence is constantly being discovered, as if its hands are tied. The biggest danger from this is, we can be completely ignoring the true origins of COVID-19. The next section is entitled How to Explain the Early Cases in the US. It says, 2 years into the pandemic, scientists and research institutes around the world continue to discover new signs of COVID-19 spreading within their own country even earlier than the outbreak identified in Wuhan. Amongst the most shocking revelations, the US National Institutes of Health announced that the coronavirus has been spreading with the United States ahead of Wuhan due to antibodies found in local human samples collected by the end of 2019. The finding helped Americans explain the strange pneumonia they got in 2019. Australia is mentioned once in the article. It appears in the section that the earliest virus variant come from the US. And the paragraph says, in April 2020, the scientific journal Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences published a research finding that amongst the earliest COVID-19 virus, there were 3 earliest variants, type A, B, and C. The genealogical analysis revealed that type B and C developed from type A, and type A is mainly found in the US and Australia, while type B mainly emerged in China and in East Asia, and Type C is mainly discovered in Europe and Brazil. Based on this impression on how Australia is constructed, I think in this case, this would be a neutral representation. We'll move along to the next piece. Published on the 17th of March and found in the opinion/viewpoint section. The following headline reads, US ready to fight to the last drop of Ukrainian European blood, former UK MP. The article is accompanied with a video, 4 minutes and 14 seconds in length.
After all, it's only 6 months or so ago that the United States had to steal out of Afghanistan like a...
And the opening paragraph reads, it comes with an editor's note, and it says, the working class of Europe and North America will pay the price of the NATO-crazed suicide mission against Russia, tweeted George Galloway, 6th-term British parliamentarian. He believes the US is ready to fight to the last drops of Ukrainian blood in the end. It's prepared to fight to the last drop of European blood. Why does he say so? That's his take. What's his take on the ongoing Ukraine crisis? Galloway shared his opinions in a video talk with Global Times reporter Xu Hailin. The opening question from the Global Times reads, you tweeted that the working class of Europe and North America will pay the price of the NATO-crazed suicide mission against Russia. There are now energy crises in Europe and the US, with energy prices jumping, affecting ordinary people's lives. To what extent will this restrain politicians' behaviors? Galloway's response, in the short term, none at all. We are gung-ho to fight to the last drop of Ukrainian blood, but the pain and suffering that will be inflicted on their own people at home, working class people, poor people who are already suffering a massive loss, not just in the price of energy, that's obvious. Gas that was 48 pence per therm this time last year is now almost 800 pence per therm. Begin to calculate what that will mean in domestic and manufacturing, industrial, transport, aviation, all the industries that depend on energy and on fuel. But it isn't just the price of gas. It isn't just the price of petrol, because an increase in the price of both feeds into every other sector of the economy, especially in this economy, which is now more than ever dependent on Deliveroo and on Amazon and the others who deliver to you daily rather than you having to go to the shops. Australia is mentioned once in the article, and it's mentioned in response to the following question from the Global Times. The West calls for a ceasefire, but seems to be escalating the conflicts. Is the West contradicting itself? If so, why? And Galloway's response, there is a difference of opinion between Europe and the US, UK, Anglo-Saxon alliance. You might throw Australia into that mix also. Europe knows that if this war escalates, if it becomes an explicit NATO-Russia war, then the exchange of battlefield and then intermediate-range nuclear weapons may not be that far away. If you do the math, the battlefield and the intermediate is the European continent. It would take some escalation for this to become an intercontinental ballistic missile, thermonuclear or hypersonic nuclear conflict, and that would bring about the end of the world. Just as the US is ready to fight to the last drop of Ukrainian blood in the end, it's prepared to fight to the last drop of European blood. So Europeans want a ceasefire much more than the US does. That's why all the talk about no-fly zones and so on, which could lead to an all-out war, coming mainly from American politicians, American media, and American-driven social media platforms. Based on this initial impression, I think it's fair to say that Australia is represented and constructed as a repulsive other, right? Being part of this US-UK Anglo-Saxon alliance. We'll move along to the next article. And this next piece is published on the 18th of March. And it comes with the following headline. GT investigates China's zero COVID policy, flexible measures ensure minimum impact on supply chains. Written by Chu Daye, business reporter at the Global Times. The article is accompanied with a photograph with the following captions. Containers carrying goods for the third China International Import-Export wait at Yangshan Port in Shanghai. Photo by CNS Photo. The opening paragraph of this article reads, concerns by some US media outlets over potential supply chain hiccups as a round of Omicron cases hits some of China's major manufacturing commercial cities are a testament to China's prominence in the global supply chain, analysts and industry insiders said on Friday. While some sectors are inevitably affected during the current fight to contain the virus, the overall health of the supply chain in China remains sound, thanks to the effective dynamic zero-COVID strategy, and as cities swiftly resume production, the impact of this round of epidemic flare-ups will be very limited, they said. As the worst outbreak in 2 years caused by the highly contagious Omicron variant hit many of China's manufacturing hubs, US media outlets have rushed to flag supply chain concerns and delays at ports, citing the suspension of plants run by big companies including Toyota, Volkswagen, Tesla, and Apple OEM Foxconn. However, economists said what people are seeing this week in China is not comparable to the US, where serious supply chain issues from ports to warehouses are playing a part to fuel record inflation. Australia is mentioned once in the article and appears here in the concluding paragraph, and I'll read through the paragraph that comes before as well. Morgan Stanley cut its economic growth forecast for China to zero for the current quarter versus the final 3 months of 2021, while Goldman Sachs cut its 2022 forecast for China's economic growth from 4.8% to 4.3%. The Australia and New Zealand banking group recently published a report on the economic cost of China's COVID-0 approach, concluding that the policy has a limited impact on the economy because measures are highly localized and targeted, estimating that the economic impact will only be 0.6% of GDP. Based on this initial impression, I think it's fair to say Australia is represented in a neutral manner. We'll move along to the next article. This next article is directed towards the human rights record of Australia alongside the US and Canada. This is an infographic found in the politics section and written by Feng Qingyin. The headline reads, Human rights violations against Indigenous people in the US, Canada, and Australia. So there are a number of infographics here provided by the Global Times with the source attributed to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The first infographic reads, Human rights violations against Indigenous people in the US. Indigenous people currently account for only 1.3% of the American population. Life expectancy of Native Americans is 5.5 years shorter than average. Some other important bits of information include Indigenous reservations accounting for only 2.3% of US territories are located in remote and barren places. We scroll down to the final infographic, which is directed towards Australia, and a startling number which is being reviewed here of the population of Aboriginal people in Australia plummeted from around 1 million in the pre-colonial era to 74,000 in the 1930s due to genocide and forced labor. Life expectancy is 7.8 to 8.6 years shorter than other groups. As of March 2020, Aboriginal people detained in Australian prisons accounted for nearly 30% of all detainees. Based on this initial impression, I think it's fair to say Australia is represented in a negative manner. We'll move along to the next article, entitled Canberra Balloon Spectacular Festival, originally published by Xinhua and found in the Photo/World section. The article is accompanied with a number of photographs, and the first image comes with the following captions. Hot air balloons are seen during the annual Canberra Balloon Spectacular Festival in Canberra, Australia, March 18th, 2022. The annual Canberra Balloon Spectacular Festival, a hot air balloon festival celebrated in Australia's capital city, is held this year from March 12th to 20th. There are a few more images that accompany the article, and it looks like they all have captions that are a copy of each other. Based on this initial impression, I think one might make the argument that Australia is being represented in a positive manner, which hasn't been happening for a while now. So it's good to see some balance. We'll move along to the next article. This one is entitled Morrison Clamours for China's Sanctions but Ignores Abomination of Australia. This is found in the Opinion/Observer section, and it's accompanied by an image of the Australian Prime Minister. The opening paragraph of the article reads, "Anyone with a sober mind could see clearly which country is behind the Ukraine crisis and which is inciting Kyiv to exacerbate the situation, but not Scott Morrison." The Australian Prime Minister reportedly said his government will move in lockstep with its allies and partners to introduce sanctions against China if China were to provide military equipment to Russia. He even said that any move by China to arm Russia would be an abomination. Australia is mentioned multiple times in the article, 24 in total, not regarding the ones appearing here in the related articles. So let's take a closer look. In the third paragraph, why didn't Australia suggest its US allies stop its military support to Ukraine? If the intention of Australia is to de-escalate tensions, both China and Russia have denied US allegations that China would provide military aid to Russia. Still, Australia chose to play with this disinformation, which only shows that it is a lackey of the US. Australia has little stake in the Ukraine issue. It is not a NATO member, has no geopolitical entanglement with Ukraine, and is far away from Ukraine and Russia. The sole stake is to safeguard US interests within the framework of its alliance with the US. Qin Sheng, Executive Research Fellow at the Center for Australia, New Zealand and South Pacific Studies of the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, told the Global Times. Even the Australian top leader does not view his country as independent and sovereign, but positions itself as a follower of the US. When he said that Australia will move in lockstep with allies sanctioning on China, it actually indicates that Australia has no ability to do it alone. Morrison's bluff to side with allies to sanction China can only be viewed as a joke. China and Australia are not at the same level in terms of economic volume. Australia needs China's market much more than China needs Australia, and Australia's exports to China are either replaceable or can almost be ignored, according to Chen Hong, president of the Chinese Association of Australian Studies and professor and director of the Australian Studies Centre at East China Normal University. Australia's business ties with China have already suffered a great deal due to worsening relations with its largest trading partner as a result of the Australian government's furious anti-China agenda. So I have noticed a pattern of anti-China agenda appearing repeatedly in the 3 months or so since I've begun tracking the Global Times. But to qualify that anti-China agenda with the term furious, that is a first, a furious anti-China agenda. Before making any sanctioned moves, Australia should look to the US for some clues. In the past years, Washington has kept imposing new sanctions on China. It waged a near trade war with China, included Chinese high-tech companies to its exports watch list, and imposed sanctions on Chinese officials over a number of excuses. But in the end, Washington failed to get what it desired by imposing sanctions. Australia touts itself as a middle power, but it is just a middle-sized economy, which is biting off more than it can chew. I think that deserves an instant replay. That's a first. Australia touts itself as a middle power, but it is just a middle-sized economy, which is biting off more than it can chew. Chen told the Global Times, adding that it will only invite countermeasures from China if Australia takes any substantive move. And even for the sake of the election campaign, Morrison should think about to what extent such rhetoric could work. Talking about abomination, Australia has followed the US to commit a heinous massacre of civilians in Afghanistan, and justice has not yet been served. This is the real abomination. I don't quite have a category for extremely negative set into place yet. I'm not sure if that's something I should add into my measuring system. This is, I think, painting Australia as beyond negative. This is an extremely negative representation of Australia, and that can be encapsulated with this line over here. It's really just a middle-sized economy which is biting off more than it can chew. And to rub further salt into the wound, Australia had followed the US to commit a heinous massacre of civilians in Afghanistan, and justice has not yet been served. A very clear case of the othering offensive. We'll move along to the next article. Entitled, Australians Celebrate 90th Anniversary of Iconic Sydney Harbour Bridge. This is found in the Photo/World section of the Global Times, published March 19th, 7:50 p.m. The article is accompanied by an image, a photograph of the Harbour Bridge, with the following captions. Photo taken on March 18th, 2022, shows vivid light on Harbour Bridge in Sydney, Australia as part of the Sydney Harbour Bridge 90th anniversary celebration. To mark the 90th year since the completion of Sydney Harbour Bridge, Sydney-siders headed into the harbour on Saturday to pay homage to the bridge that has connected and inspired generations of Australians. Australia is mentioned a total of 10 times in the article, twice in the captions, and a few more in the body paragraphs, as well as the remaining captions. Let's have a read through the opening paragraph. To mark the 90th year since the completion of Sydney Harbour Bridge, Sydney-siders headed into the harbour on Saturday to pay homage to the bridge that has connected and inspired generations of Australians. A host of events littered Sydney's harbour as locals and tourists from across the city rang in the bridge's 9th decade of regular use, including a spectacular lighting up of the bridge at night, a number of pop-up art galleries and museums displaying the bridge's history, musical and dramatic performances, and a commemorative vintage train ride. Australia is mentioned again in the following paragraphs, and this is when the article takes on a little bit of a different tone. On this date, 90 years ago, the Sydney Harbour Bridge came to life, and so too did the vision of a modern Sydney. More than 1 million people crossed the bridge on its opening day, in trams, trains, and on foot, which was almost the entire population of Sydney at that time. Despite what the scale of the feat might suggest, its construction and completion came at a time of extreme poverty in Australia's Great Depression, when unemployment hit a staggering 32% in 1931. Sophie Lloyd-Wilson, an expert in Australian history from the University of Sydney, said the bridge became a symbol of hope. The bridge was expensive, but it represented hope and a better life for Sydney people. Sandstone excavations caused dust and debris, but also uncovered fossils and other structure and treasures, said Lloyd-Wilson. The story of the Harbour Bridge is a story of a city on its knees, looking up towards the largest structure the city had ever seen being pieced together across Sydney Harbour. The next photograph that accompanies the article has the following captions. Photo taken on March 18th, 2022 shows vivid light on Harbour Bridge in Sydney, Australia as part of the Sydney Harbour Bridge 90th anniversary celebration. Based on this initial impression of the article, I think it's fair to say Australia is represented here in more than a neutral manner, but in a somewhat positive, maybe even positive light. An interesting balance and contrast of articles coming from the Global Times this week. We'll keep moving along to the next piece. Entitled, US, Canada, Australia advised to reflect on wrongdoings, violations of Indigenous people's rights at side event of UN Human Rights Council, found in the China/Diplomacy section and published 19th March at 11:57 a.m. The article is accompanied by an image with the following captions. A woman takes a picture during a session on the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva on September 13th, 2021. The opening paragraph of this article reads, the US, Canada, and Australia are advised to reflect seriously on the wrongdoings in history, immediately amend laws and change policies that violate Indigenous people's rights, investigate the crimes and hold the perpetrators accountable. Jiang Duan, Minister of the Chinese mission to the UN in Geneva, said at a side event during the 49th session of the Human Rights Council on Friday. The Permanent Mission of Venezuela and the Permanent Mission of China co-hosted the side event with the theme Systemic Violations of Indigenous People's Rights by the US, Canada, and Australia on Friday. More than 150 people, including foreign diplomats in Geneva, scholars, representatives of non-governmental organizations, and media, attended the event. Australia is mentioned a total of 11 times in the article, and they appear here, shedding light on the White Australia policy. And this paragraph reads, the Chinese envoy noted that since the beginning of last year, there has been a shocking discovery and distressing discovery of a large number of unnamed graves and remains of Indigenous children in Canada. In much of its history, Australia pursued the notorious White Australia policy, under which some 100,000 Aboriginal children, were forcibly taken away from their families, causing lifetime harm and trauma to the stolen generation. Serious violations of Indigenous people's rights by the US, Canada, and Australia are not just something of the past, but a matter of chronic and systemic racism that continues to this day, said Jiang, noting that today Indigenous people are still subject to widespread and systemic discrimination and inequality in these countries and are marginalized and left at the bottom of society politically, economically, and culturally. The Chinese diplomat said that the US, Canada, and Australia are advised to reflect seriously on their wrongdoings in history. The diplomat added that multilateral human rights bodies such as the Human Rights Council and the OHCHR should take action on serious violations of Indigenous people's rights in these countries. The permanent representative of Venezuela to the United Nations office at Geneva, Hector Constant Rosales, said during the side event that the US, Canada, and Australia have always lectured other countries on human rights, but their own human rights situations are shocking. Australia is mentioned once again in this paragraph, and it reads, the US, Canada, and Australia also make blatant accusations of other countries and impose unilateral sanctions which have brought about disasters globally, Ambassador Rosales said, calling on the international community to pay attention to these countries' violations of human rights and hold perpetrators accountable. Envoys from North Korea and Russia also attended the event and criticized the discrimination towards Indigenous people and expressed concerns over the human rights situation in the US, Canada, and Australia. No further mentions of Australia is found in this article, and based on this initial impression, I think it's pretty clear that it is a negative representation of Australia. And beyond that, painting them as a repulsive other, right, guilty of what was the White Australia policy and also the stolen generation. We move along to the next article. This one is entitled US-led Western Sanctions Rally Successful and to Backfire Eventually, written by Wen Sheng, March 19th, 10:56 a.m., and found in the Source/Economy section of the Global Times. The opening paragraph of the article reads, the US, relying on the dollar's international reserve currency status as well as the attractiveness of its market size, has been wielding its cudgel of economic and financial sanctions for many years, placing many countries, entities, and individuals under its coercive sanctions regime. The article is accompanied with a graphic and an illustration by Teng Fei, with what appears to be an American symbolism of America holding on to a cudgel that's far too heavy to wield or lift, with an undertone questioning the efficacy of such a move. At least that's my read of it. Moving along to the next paragraph. Lately, the world has witnessed the Biden administration, leading its hardcore allies in Europe and Asia Pacific, rushed to put a plethora of harsh sanctions on Russia over the conflict in Ukraine. The purpose of these sweeping sanctions is to stifle or destroy Russia's economy and possibly induce a color revolution in Moscow. Australia is mentioned once in the article and appears here in the following paragraph. Following the US government, the UK, Canada, Australia, the EU, Japan, and South Korea have also moved to impose similar sanctioning measures on Russia, which in the eyes of many independent observers of geopolitics acted like a herd of boars swooping at a bear. I think that deserves an instant replay, which in the eyes of many independent observers of geopolitics acted like a herd of boars swooping at a bear. Some European countries like Germany and France, which depend on Russian supply of natural gas, oil and coal to providing winter heating and daily industrial use energy, are also asked to set a deadline of upending energy imports from Australia. Based on this initial impression, I think it's fair to say that Australia is represented in a somewhat negative to a negative manner. Even though the article is not directed towards Australia, it's bunching up Australia with the US government, the UK, the Canada, the EU, and Japan as part of this herd of boars swooping at the bear. Interesting metaphor. With that said, we'll move along to the next article. Published on the 20th of March, this article has the following headline: Lobbyist Kishida fails to swear India on Ukraine during visit. Written by Xu Yelu and Xu Keyue. It's from the China/diplomacy section and is accompanied by photograph with the following captions. Japan's Prime Minister Fumio Kishida and his Indian counterparts applaud during their meeting at the Hyderabad House in New Delhi on March 19th, 2022. The opening paragraph reads, Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida failed to persuade India to take a similar position over the Ukraine crisis as its partners, the US, Japan and Russia, and Australia, in the Quad mechanism during his meeting with his Indian counterpart Narendra Modi, given that the joint statement published following the meeting did not mention Russia, let alone imposing sanctions against Russia. Although Kishida pushed Modi on Saturday to take a tougher line on Russia over the Ukraine issue, during his first visit to India after he took office, the joint statement issued later showed that the Japanese lobbying did not meet the expectations of Washington and Canberra, as none of the other three Quad members carries the weight to persuade their ally India to sacrifice its own national interests, given that Russia plays an important role in India's strategic policy, experts said. Australia is mentioned a number of times in the article, and beyond that mention in the opening paragraph is mentioned again here. while court members of the US, Japan, and Australia have imposed sanctions on dozens of Russian individuals and organizations since the Ukraine crisis, India has refrained from commenting directly. Also, India has abstained in 3 UN votes deploring Moscow's actions, calling only for a halt in the violence. Australia is mentioned again in this paragraph, and it reads, India has not followed the US, Japan, and Australia in imposing sanctions on Russia in the wake of the Ukraine crisis, which, quote-unquote, worried the other 3, shaking the foundation of a unified front under the Quad mechanism. At an urgent meeting of the Quad Alliance on March the 3rd, Kishida, US President Joe Biden, and Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison failed to convince Modi to take a tougher line on Russia. A joint Quad statement issued after the meeting said they discussed the ongoing conflict and humanitarian crisis in Ukraine and assessed its broader implications without any unified condemnation of Moscow. Australia is mentioned once more in this paragraph, and it reads, in recent years, China-India relations have suffered major setbacks due to border issues. Experts said that on the one hand, India hopes to strengthen cooperation with the US, Japan, and Australia to increase its leverage against China. On the other hand, if the Quad mechanism pushes India to the front line against China and lets India bear the losses alone, these are scenarios India is unlikely to accept. Australia is mentioned in the concluding paragraph as well, and that reads, it can be predicted that although the US, Japan, and Australia will continue to woo India for the purpose of so-called containment of China, but India will be reluctant to be their cannon fodder, so their motivation may also be reduced due to India's response, and they will consider whether the costs and rewards of wooing India are proportional, Qian said. Based on this impression of the article, I think it's fair to say Australia is represented here as negative and repulsive, responsible as part of the group of powers attempting to contain China. We move along to the next article. This is the 19th article for the week relating to Australia, and this is one of the few directed towards the country. This one's entitled Liberal Party Suffers Shock Defeat in South Australia Ahead of National Polls. Originally by Reuters and published March 20th at 5:57 p.m. This is found in the World/Asia Pacific section of the Global Times. The opening paragraph reads, Prime Minister Scott Morrison's Liberal Party has lost power in the state of South Australia in a shock election defeat that raises concerns for the federal government, which has to face national polls in about 2 months. The centre-left Labour Party took power in South Australia, which has a population of about 1.8 million people, after Liberal Party leader Stephen Marshall conceded defeat following the elections late on Saturday. Australia is mentioned a number of times in the article, 10 times in total. Apologies for that. Taking away these 2, it would be 7 mentions of Australia in total. Australia's reference here as well. Marshall is the first incumbent leader to lose power since the start of the pandemic in Australia, and raises concerns for Prime Minister Morrison, who is facing a stiff contest in his re-election campaign. The concluding paragraph of this article reads, Opposition Labour leader Anthony Albanese has drawn level with Morrison as preferred Prime Minister for the first time since the pandemic outbreak, according to a news poll published last week. Based on this initial impression, I think this is a slightly tricky one. I would probably categorize this as somewhat negative. And now the final article for the week relating to Australia. Published on March 20th at 5:26 p.m. It comes with the following headline: 2 Australian scientists commit to plastic waste reduction initiative. And this was in the World/Asia Pacific section. The article is accompanied with a photograph of the Sydney Opera House, a photo taken on October 11th, 2021, and the opening paragraph reads, Australia's National Science Agency has made a commitment to help reduce the country's plastic waste by 80% over the 10 years. The Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organisation, the CSIRO, on Sunday announced a further investment in its Ending Plastic Waste mission. The initiative will receive 50 million Australian dollars in funding from the CSIRO, industry, governments and universities to develop cutting-edge innovations for how Australia makes, uses, recycles and disposes of plastics. Australians currently use 1 million tonnes of single-use plastic every year, only 12% of which is recycled. Australia is mentioned a number of times in this article. And it reads, the Ending Plastic Waste mission will bring together the whole innovation system from government, industry and academia to turn science into solutions that benefit the environment and create economic opportunities for Australia, he said. By turning plastic waste into a renewable resource, the mission will deliver collaborative scientific and manufacturing capabilities to drive new technologies across the entire plastics supply chain and grow Australia's circular economy. The CSIRO launched its Team Australia Missions project in August 2020 with an aim of using major scientific and collaborative research initiatives to solve the country's biggest challenges, including plastic waste, climate change, pandemics, and natural disasters. Based on this initial impression, I think it's fair to say Australia is represented and constructed in a positive manner. That concludes our look at the headlines and the articles from the Global Times for the week, Monday, 14th of March to Sunday, the 20th of March. We now turn our attention over to Sky News Australia. The first article from Sky News Australia. There has been a flurry of articles relating to China in Sky News Australia this week. In the previous week, there were just 5. For this week, starting from Monday 14th of March to Sunday 20th of March, there were 20. We begin with the first one. And this is entitled, Russia Requests Economic Military Aid from China Amid Ukraine War, says US officials. The subheader, Russia has sensationally turned to China for military and economic assistance as the war in Ukraine continues to ravage on. Written by Tyrone Clark, March 14th, 2022 at 12:46 p.m. The article is accompanied with a video with the title, Hint from China that they may not be so bonded to Putin as we thought, according to Chris Smith. And the video is 37 seconds in length. And the opening line of this article reads, Russia has requested military and economic aid from China, according to US officials, as Vladimir Putin's brutal invasion of Ukraine continues. As Russian forces continue to circle Kyiv, multiple US media outlets have confirmed Moscow has asked Beijing for assistance. According to the New York Times, on top of reported military aid, included drones, China has been approached to provide further economic help as Russia continues to be slammed from Western sanctions. China is mentioned multiple times in this article. All up, we're looking at 20 times. And let's continue to unpack what this article says. The officials have refused to reveal details of the intelligence, but it comes as National Security Advisor Jack Sullivan is set to meet his Chinese counterpart Yang Jiechi in Rome on Monday. Another video accompanies the article entitled, There are many reasons to be concerned over Russia and China's friendship. The article then goes on to say, Mr. Sullivan on Sunday said the United States was watching closely whether China does provide support. Despite reports of military requests, a spokesperson for China's embassy in Washington told CNN that he had never
Thank you very much
heard of that. The article is accompanied with another video entitled Russia and China's Ambitions Go Beyond Ukraine and Taiwan, says Dutton. And China is mentioned once more in the following paragraph. The high priority now is to prevent the tense situation from escalating or even getting out of control. China calls for exercising utmost restraint and preventing a massive humanitarian crisis. As the United States, the EU, Australia and countries across the world continue to level severe sanctions on Russia's elite and its major institutions, China has moved to support its ally in Moscow. The two countries signed a no-limits friendship treaty only weeks before Vladimir Putin launched his invasion, while reports emerged that Beijing urged Moscow to hold off the war until after the Olympics. China also went ahead with easing trade restrictions on Russian wheat, just as Western sanctions begin to target Moscow's financial systems and institutions, as well as the country's most powerful and wealthiest individuals. The article is then accompanied with an image, a photograph with the following captions. Vladimir Putin reportedly briefed Chinese President Xi Jinping of his intentions to invade Ukraine whilst in Beijing for the Winter Olympic Games. The article then moves on to say, Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman Zhao Lijian recently hit out at Western retaliatory measures and said wielding the big stick of sanctions would not solve the war in Ukraine. It has long been proven that rather than addressing the problem, sanctions will create new problems, he said during his daily press briefing on Thursday. The US should not impose so-called sanctions and long-arm jurisdiction on Chinese companies and individuals or undermine the legitimate rights and interests of China. Otherwise, China will make a strong and resolute response. Let's take a close look at the comments that have been generated as a result. The first by Happy Go Lucky. The Chinese embassy in the US says there's no information about Russia's alleged request to China for military assistance. Although Russia and China are in bed together, they both sleep with one eye open. From Rob007. Old Crow. US officials say a lot of stuff like Iraq having weapons of mass destruction, which turned out to be a huge porky. And there's a post by David. So much going on and we're worried about electric cars and removing our cheap sources of energy. Have people forgotten that backing Putin and a nuclear-powered Russia into a corner is not the answer? Ukraine is a very complicated issue and the West's meddling of it will not end well, I think. It's been given 3 likes and a number of responses, such as this one from Brian. I like your thought that the West is backing Russia into a corner. Not that Russia is invading a democratic country with an added threat of nuclear action by Russia. Frankly, electric cars and cheap energies are not issues in this confrontation. We had to back Hitler into a corner. It was not complicated at all. A post from Mel. Beyond that, this is the end of the US dollar in the West. China makes everything we consume, from food additives to bikes, computers, furniture, etc., and have just done an oil deal with the Saudis that doesn't seem to be being broadcast. The West cannot afford to boycott Chinese goods and then somehow stop manufacturing, thereby increasing pollution. When we've shut everything down, we've crippled ourselves, gave it all to China, and now both Russia and Beijing can do anything they like and destroy the West, all thanks to greed and left-wing anti-pollution policies. And that's garnered 5 likes with a response. Great comment. Here's another one by John Catsby. If the Russian government feels it is justified in an invasion of the Ukraine, then perhaps China is watching the outcome of the Ukraine conflict with another agenda in mind. The Russian territories between the Tumen River and the Sea of Japan would be a very inviting addition to the People's Republic of China. Their strategic and economic importance to China and perhaps the prospect of a far less costly acquisition than an invasion of Taiwan. Given Russia's military inability to achieve a quick and decisive result in Ukraine, may well be seen as a considerably more attractive opportunity for an expansionist China. Taiwan would fight to the end, and the best China would get is an island of scorched earth. The Russian border territories would be a far more attractive prize, in my opinion. Interesting. China will assist Russia by placing troops in Siberia. Only problems, they stay permanently. That's a response from Phil. And that's the scan of the discourse generated from this article. We'll move along to the next piece. It's found in the World News Global Affairs section, and it's accompanied by a video entitled "Too Many Downsides for China to Become Aligned with Russia and Ukraine." Duration 4 minutes and 26 seconds. Published March 14th, 2022 at 4:18 p.m. The opening lines read, former Pentagon advisor Jason Israel says there are too many downsides for China to become aligned with Russia following reports that Moscow has asked Beijing for military equipment to support its invasion of Ukraine. US officials are concerned that Beijing may undermine Western efforts to help Ukrainian forces defend their country, according to the Financial Times. China is mentioned 8 times in the article. It's mentioned here in this paragraph, but the big question is, would China take its long-standing policy of not getting involved in these issues overseas, in other countries, and put itself aligned with Russia at this time? All of its national interests would say no. Mr. Israel said nothing in the statement released after Chinese President Xi Jinping and his Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin met last month on the sidelines of the Olympics, indicated they were growing into an alliance where Moscow would turn to China. Russia has a lot of illicit funds, hundreds of billions of dollars running through the world. It's already hiring mercenaries from other countries to help fight in Ukraine. So my view is that they could make that overture privately, Mr. Israel told Sky News Australia. China would not likely retaliate unless it was on the black market, and they could somehow avoid attribution from that. Because China becoming sort of aligned with Russia in this, there's too many downsides for China. Based on this impression, I think Australia, Sky News Australia is representing and constructing China in a negative manner, in them making a mistake if they were to be aligned with China because of the number of downsides. With that, we'll move along to the next article. But before I do so, a quick look through and scan through if there are any comments. It looks like there isn't at this moment for the article. And with that, we'll move along. This is found in the opinion Paul Murray section of Sky News Australia, with the headline reading, Russia asking China for military help is as serious as it gets. It's accompanied with a video clip 1 minute and 29 seconds in length, and that's given the title, Russia asking for China for military help is as serious as it gets. So same one as the online version. So the opening lines read, Sky News host Paul Murray says it is particularly scary that Russia has asked China for economic and military help, support for the war in Ukraine. It happened in the past 24 hours, and it is as serious as this thing gets, Mr. Murray said. Because put simply, as the West has been trying to help Ukraine, Russia now wants China's help. In this instance, I think it's pretty clear that China is represented in a particularly perhaps repulsive light, because if China were to respond to Russia's call, then clearly they are pretty significantly putting themselves within the sphere of the other. We'll move along to the next article, and this one was published on March 14th, 2022 at 11:02 p.m. Found in the World News United States section. This next article comes with the headline, US warns China against supporting Russia. It's accompanied by a video 53 seconds in duration. The opening lines read, US National Security Advisor Jack Sullivan has met with top Chinese diplomat Yang Jiechi to stress the economic penalties China would face if it provides military support to Russia. This was published March 15th, 2022 at 6:50 a.m. The article goes on to say Chinese state broadcaster CCTV reported the meeting had taken place in Rome, but provided no other details. Mr. Sullivan planned to warn his Chinese counterpart of the global isolation and trade consequences Beijing would face if they continued to support Russia. US officials yesterday reported Russia had asked China for military equipment after its invasion of Ukraine. Based on this initial impression, I think it's fair to say that China is represented in a negative light. We'll move along to the next article. This next piece was found in the Australian News Politics section, accompanied with a video 5 minutes 33 seconds in duration. The headlines read, Australia should be doing much more to reduce dependency on China. Published March 15th, 2022 at 8:42 a.m. The opening lines read, National Senator Matt Canavan says Australia should be seeking to reduce its dependence on China. The reality right now is if we were to impose significant sanctions on China, that would put many parts of our economy to a standstill. Mr. Canavan told Sky News Australia, and we should be doing much more to reduce that dependence. Clearly a negative representation, drawing a line in the sand, signaling that the future of Australia is one of less reliance on China. We'll move along to the next article. Published on the 15th of March, 11:24 a.m. This next headline reads, Careful approach required for China sanctions. It's accompanied with a video 5 minutes and 40 seconds in duration and found within the Australian News Politics section. The opening line reads, Former Labour Senator Stephen Conroy says Australia needs to be careful on sanctioning China as global tensions escalate. Mr. Conroy said any sanctions on China needs to be proportionate and sustained, noting the global importance of the Chinese economy. China will retaliate, he told Sky News Australia. We need to be careful and all for making sure that we apply maximum pressure, but we just need to be proportionate. In the case of this one, I might need to read through this again, because this is not overtly negative. Maybe I'll park it as somewhat negative for now. Until it's time to review this, somewhat negative would be my call. And with that, we'll move along to the next article. Entitled, Fears China May Provide Military or Economic Support to Russia. Quite a flurry of activity on March the 15th, looking specifically at Chinese support towards the Russians, and this one is the next. It's published March 15th, 2022, 11:57 a.m. The previous article was published just 30 minutes prior at 11:24. This piece is accompanied by a video 3 minutes and 7 seconds in length, and the opening lines read, United States officials are warning China could agree to Russia's request for military and economic assistance. There are fears the move could prolong the war in Ukraine. US officials are concerned China would supply weapons to Russia after an intense discussion between US National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan and top Chinese diplomat Yang Jiechi in Rome. There is no confirmation China has agreed to provide weapons or economic support to Russia. In terms of how China is constructed, I think this would sit within the range of somewhat negative to negative, given that there's a disclaimer at the end of the article. There's no confirmation as of yet with regards to China's agreement to provide weapons or economic support. Moving along to the next piece. It comes with the headline, China accuses US of maliciously spreading disinformation, as White House says it has deep concerns of Beijing-Moscow ties. The subheader reads, tensions between the US, China and Russia continue to rise as a senior Biden administration official declares the White House has deep concerns about the relationship between Beijing and Moscow. It comes with 18 comments, which we'll unpack later. This was written by Tyrone Clark, March 15th, 2022 at 12:20 p.m. The article is accompanied with a video 3 minutes and 7 seconds in duration, entitled Fears China May Provide Military or Economic Support to Russia. The opening lines of this article reads, the United States has deep concerns about China's closer relationship with Russia, while Beijing has accused Washington of maliciously spreading disinformation. China appears 30 times throughout the article, and the next line reads, President Joe Biden's National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan met with his Chinese counterpart and Communist Party Politburo member Jiang Jiechi in Rome for a mammoth summit on Monday. The meeting only came hours after reports emerged that Russia had requested military and economic aid from China as international pressure mounts over its invasion of Ukraine. Following the intense 7-hour session, a senior Biden administration official said the two envoys had an extensive conversation about Russia's war in Ukraine. There are two accompanying photographs, and the captions read, CCP Politburo member Yang Jiechi pictured, and U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan met in Rome as tensions build over Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And an accompanying image right next to it comes with the following captions. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said the U.S. was watching closely whether China provides further support to Russia. The next paragraph reads, we do have concerns about China's alignment with Russia at this time, and the National Security Advisor was direct about those concerns and the potential implications and consequences of certain actions, the official told reporters on Monday. We believe that it is important to keep open lines of communication between the United States and China, especially on areas where we disagree. According to the New York Times, on top of reported military aid, including drones, China has been approached to provide further economic help as Russia continues to be slammed from Western sanctions. Ahead of his meeting in Rome, Mr. Sullivan said the United States would not stand by and allow China to compensate Russia, as further reports have emerged that Beijing is considering bailing out the Russian economy. Defense Press Secretary Ned Price said that it would be of greatest concern if Beijing was propping up Moscow, as any country that would seek to bail out Russia out of this economic financial morass will be met with consequences.
Joining me live now is the Defence and Security.
We will ensure that no country is able to get away with such a thing. There's a further video accompanying the article entitled Entirely Plausible. China will give weapons to Russia. And there are further mentions of China all the way through, including this paragraph. Countries like the PRC have over the years touted and brandished the concept of sovereignty, often pointing to sovereignty in any manner in any matter of foreign policy and diplomacy. If the concept of sovereignty means anything in practice to a country like the PRC, we would expect countries like that to stand up, to speak out, to make clear that a blatant violation of state sovereignty, the likes of which we have not heretofore seen in this century, is unacceptable. China swiftly responded to the reports. It was considering sending military aid and supporting Russia's flailing economy. Foreign Ministry spokesman Zhao Lijian said the United States had been maliciously spreading disinformation targeting China and denied there was a formal request from Moscow. On the Ukraine question, any disinformation that dismisses China's efforts misrepresents China's intentions and smears China designed to deflect the problem, stoke provocation, and profit from the issue, Mr. Zhao said during his regular press briefing on Monday. It is neither responsible nor ethical. We'll have a look at the comments that have been generated as a result of this discourse. And the first one reads from the Republican 2. Western world, get out of China. They have shown evil intent. How stupid are you? Happy-go-lucky response. 81% of all global military actions since 1950 have been initiated by the US. But it's okay because their intent was quote-unquote spreading democracy. And Brian's response, or defending democracy. Khan says, not quite, Brian. The intent has been and always has been to spread plutocracy under the media-fed narrative. Plutocracy, apologies, under the media-fed narrative. That's it's democracy. USA FreeCom, US EUCom, US Indo-PACCom, plus 4 others. That's what really democracy means to the USA. Look it up. It's frightening to the US and its lackey allies. The word democracy is misrepresented and abused to our detriment. Daxie's response: if China aids Russia, then the same sanctions should apply to them as well. Happy-go-lucky says, rest of the entire world concerned about US ties to Ukraine and seemingly endless stream of easily debunked disinformation from the US. The Americans can choose their friends, Australia can choose our friends, why can't the Russians or the Chinese? And Brian's response to that one from Andrew: they're both autocracies, dictatorships like North Korea, Iran, Venezuela, etc., and have total control of their populations through propaganda media, and want to combine to bring down democracies like most of the rest of the world, including Australia. Would you like that? And Khan's response: Brian, the facts say otherwise. The only dictatorships in this world are those military ones that are financially and militarily supported by the US government because there's a buck in it for them, both. If a nation wants to be what we call communist or even what we call democratic, it's up to them only. It's called respect. Another comment from Riordan: I think the time we started worrying about China-Russia links was about at least 30 years ago. We try and teach our children to be cooperative but at the same time self-sufficient. Trade is a wonderful and uniting thing, but you always have to be able to fall back on your own resources where possible. In case things go wrong, the West has lost much of its self-sufficiency to the factories of China and the energy of Russia. Between the two of them, seem to have most bases covered, and of course we will keep sending them coal and ore. In Brian's response to that, the West allowed China to join the WTO and did it magnanimously to support China to get their population out of poverty and into the current century. China pretended to be grateful and showed signs that they would become like other Western nations, similar to Russia, i.e. relying on trade and being democratic. Unfortunately, this was false, and the CCCP did nothing but take advantage of the situation and build their economy at Western countries' expense, and then threatened to cut off supply. And when queried about the Wuhan COVID origin, the CCP is a wolf in wolf's clothing today and is exposed as much. Many nations around the world are now fully aware of this and are withdrawing their trade from China, forming new trade relationships. China will eventually be sorry for this deception, or will back Russia to the hilt and impose their will by force. A response from Doctor Who: China is what it is today because of Western generosity. Not because of Western generosity, but because of its greed. The Western capitalism took advantage of the cheap labor and the huge market potential to increase their profits at the expense of their own people, thinking it would last forever. They haven't listened to Deng Xiaoping, hide and bide, also known as Tao Guang Yang Hui. And so they did. All of a sudden, China has a voice, and this is rattling the cage. Like any other great power, they want their share. Whether it's the CCCP, ALP, Liberals, Democrats, Republicans, Tories, you name it, they're all the same. Power is a very potent drug, and once addicted, very hard to kick off. We'll move along to the next article. Published on the 16th of March. This article comes with the headline: China made huge mistake by not condemning Russia's invasion. The article is accompanied by a video 7 minutes and 44 seconds in length. The opening lines of the article read, Australian ministers have warned China could be hit with economic sanctions if it chooses to directly support Russia's unprovoked invasion of Ukraine. Former Australian ambassador to the People's Republic of China, Jeff Raby, says the Chinese government has made a huge mistake by not condemning the invasion. It's not possible on an issue like this to be neutral, he told Sky News Australia, simply because it's a moral question of right or wrong. And this will make yet another negative construction of China. Moving along to the next article. Published on the 15th of March, this headline reads, Russia pressing China to provide active support in military action against Ukraine. It's accompanied by a video 3 minutes and 13 seconds in duration, was found in the World News/Global Affairs section. The opening lines of this article reads, American officials have described talks between China and the US as intense, following reports Russia asked China for military assistance. SP's Mark Watson said it has been quite a significant shock for China. It had a great deal of strategic certainty not that long ago, and now it's forced to kind of take sides here. And Russia is really pressing China for more than just not being opposed to what it's doing, but to provide active support, Mr. Watson told Sky News Australia. And China, I think, is really in a very difficult position here. It doesn't want to go prematurely to alienate the rest of the world, so it's got some difficult choices. A negative construction of China. We'll move along to the next article. This is entitled, Vladimir Zelensky realizes Ukraine will not join NATO as the alliance urges China to condemn Russia over brutal invasion. The subheader reads, the military alliance has increased its calls to Beijing to condemn the war by the Kremlin, with NATO concerned Russia will stage a false flag operation in Ukraine where it could possibly use chemical weapons. Written by David Wu, digital reporter, March 16th, 2022 at 11:41 a.m. The article is accompanied with a video of 3 minutes and 47 seconds in duration, and that is entitled, Fears for Remaining Ukrainians as Kyiv Enters Curfew. The opening paragraph reads, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization has told China it needs to condemn Russia for its invasion on Ukraine as the deadly war reaches the capital. While it's difficult to ascertain the death toll, it is estimated that more than 600 Ukrainian civilians, along with 85 children, have been killed so far in the first 3 weeks of the conflict. Countless civilian buildings, including apartments, shopping centers, public transport, and hospitals, have been shelled, with the Kremlin increasing its aggression on Ukraine. Dozens of nations have already condemned the attack, but Russia's biggest ally in China is yet to denounce the invasion as it closely watched the developments. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg suggested Beijing join the rest of the world to clearly condemn the war. China should join the rest of the world in condemning strongly the brutal invasion of Ukraine by Russia, he said. China has an obligation as a member of the United Nations Security Council to actually support and uphold international law, and the Russian invasion of Ukraine is a blatant violation of the international law, so we call on China to clearly condemn the invasion and not to support Russia. China appears 10 times in the article. There's another video accompanying the article, 7 minutes and 44 seconds in duration, entitled, China made a huge mistake by not condemning Russia's invasion. there are no further mentions of China in the piece. There are two comments, and this is what they say. Doctor Who going, is this going to be a Franz Ferdinand moment? It sounds like Ukraine and US-led NATO are working on it. We have a second comment from Happy Go Lucky. So given the reality of false flags has now been acknowledged, should anything occur, all the world should be demanding hard evidence before taking any action. Does anyone honestly believe Russia will be so dumb as to use chemical weapons, as this will clearly ignite a bigger conflict? The evidence presented at the UN Security Council last Friday doesn't appear to have been reported. Why? We'll move along to the next article. And in terms of its tone, I think one could make the argument that China is constructed in a somewhat negative light for being a member of the UN Security Council and up to this point not yet joining in the chorus with the rest of the world in condemning the invasion of Ukraine. We'll move along to the next article. And it comes with the headline, China dismisses Western criticism over zero COVID response as country reports more than 5,000 cases. This was found in the World News /China section, and it comes with the following subheader. China says Western countries are just not capable of implementing a zero COVID policy as it fights to contain its worst coronavirus outbreak since the early days of the pandemic. Written by Crystal Wu and published March 16, 2022 at 2:20 p.m. The article is accompanied with a video 2 minutes and 20 seconds in duration entitled Chinese Stock Market Drop Amid Widespread Lockdown. The opening line of the article reads, China has dismissed criticism by Western media outlets over its anti-epidemic fight against COVID-19 as daily infections soar. The country is battling its worst coronavirus outbreak since the early days of the pandemic, with a total of 5,280 cases reported on Tuesday, up from 3,507 on Monday and 1,337 on Sunday. China's zero COVID policy greatly differs to other countries around the globe who are striving to live with COVID. The government's propaganda mouthpiece, the Global Times, this week hit out at the West following criticisms of its COVID-19 policy. During the recent outbreak of COVID-19 cases in China, some Western media outlets again made waves of questioning China's dynamic zero-case policy, the Global Times said. Some netizens in China were influenced by such hype and think China should act like the West to give up the dynamic zero-COVID policy and lie flat for the economy. The news outlet insisted Western countries are just not capable of implementing a zero-COVID policy in its critique. In the Global Times tweet on March 15, 2022, it says, the hashtag Chinese mainland reported a total of 15,000 hashtag COVID-19 cases from March 1st to 14th, affecting 28 provinces and regions. With an increasing number of positive cases, the difficulty in preventing and controlling the disease is also increased. Moving along the article, they move on to say, but they won't mention that Western countries are not capable of taking a dynamic zero-COVID policy rather than not willing to, it wrote. And they won't say how big a price of lives West has paid for its choice to lie flat. Chinese people cannot afford to have tens of millions of infected people. China's healthcare system cannot withstand that, while people have no normal socio-economic life. There's another accompanying video entitled China's Style is to do things behind the scenes, and it runs for 5 minutes and 3 seconds. It comes with following captions. University of Sydney Associate Professor Salvatore Barbones says he would not be surprised if China is willing to support Russia militarily, but rather that China would say it's willing to support Russia. The article continues to state China had successfully suppressed large-scale virus outbreaks over the last 2 years through its strict zero-COVID strategy, which involved harsh border controls, compulsory testing, and tough lockdowns. But since the arrival of the highly infectious Omicron strain, China has been struggling to get the virus under control. But Global Times insists China's epidemic fight cannot and will not lie flat. In the fight against COVID-19, the state is able to integrate resources, the government is responsible to the people, and the people are willing to cooperate in epidemic fight methods, the outlet wrote. These are the biggest differences between China and the West. We don't fight a battle with any preparation, and only by taking action beforehand will we be able to take the initiative in the COVID-19 prevention and control. The article is accompanied by 3 comments. First, coming in from Craig. Let us know how they go, the whole zero COVID thing. Welcome to reality 2022. They know what a hole that place is, and Republican 2 reap what you sow, China. So from first impressions, the article seems to be taking on somewhat of a neutral stance in reporting China's Global Times and its criticism of Western media outlets. But at the same time, it's allowing a certain level of transparency from Chinese media to surface to Australian audiences. So it's something I'll be taking note of. From the onset, it seems negative, but I might categorize it as somewhat negative instead. We'll move along to the next article. This one is entitled Chilling Silence from China is of Great Concern. It's accompanied with a video 2 minutes and 37 seconds in length. It was published March 16th, 2022. The opening line reads, Prime Minister Scott Morrison says there is a lack of transparency from China concerning its relationship with Russia. Mr. Morrison said China was seeking to present itself as playing a positive role in global affairs, pointing to how China lifted restrictions on Russian wheat imports. I have been concerned that there has been some implicit support that has been there for the claims of Russia in Ukraine by China, Mr. Morrison said. I don't agree with that. Australia doesn't agree with that. In this instance, I think China is clearly represented as negative as well as repulsive. There are no accompanying comments at this stage, and with that, we'll move along to the next piece. And this next one is titled, Scott Morrison slams Beijing's chilling silence over Russia's invasion of Ukraine as China is warned about consequences. It comes with a subheader. The Prime Minister said he has been disturbed by China's chilling silence over Russia's invasion of Ukraine as Beijing is warned there will be consequences for supporting Vladimir Putin's war. So a bit of a flurry of articles coming from Sky News Australia expressing and highlighting how the Australian PM is disturbed by China's chilling silence. This was written by Brian Tavesi, digital reporter, and published March 16th at 5:34 p.m. with 4 accompanying comments upon this current date of access. The article is accompanied with a video 2 minutes and 37 seconds in length, just like the previous article, and this is entitled Chilling Silence from China is of Great Concern. It comes with the captions, Prime Minister Scott Morrison says there is a lack of transparency from China concerning its relationship with Russia. Mr. Morrison said China was seeking to present itself as playing a positive role in global affairs, but is there more than meets the eye? The opening line of this article reads, Scott Morrison has slammed China's chilling silence over Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine, as he called on Beijing to come clean on its relationship with Moscow. The Prime Minister on Wednesday said he had been disturbed by China's lack of refusal to condemn Vladimir Putin's war, as he again hit out at Beijing's decision to relax trade restrictions with the nation. Mr. Morrison said there is a real lack of transparency in China and Russia's relationship, which is of great concern. And one thing that has disturbed me from the outset, apart from the obvious in terms of Russia's violent and illegal invasion of Ukraine, has been the chilling silence that we saw from China, he said. Now, at a time when the rest of the world is applying sanctions to Russia and seeking to impose a heavy price on them for the violent and aggressive actions, China actually relieved trade restrictions or trade measures on Russia on wheat, for example. There's a further video accompanying the article entitled "There Must Be Consequences for Any Country Seeking to Aid Russia in the Ukraine Invasion," and it's 2 minutes and 3 seconds in duration. Its captions read, Shadow Trade and Resources Minister Madeleine King says if any country seeks to aid Russia further in its invasion of Ukraine, there have to be quote-unquote consequences. In the next line, it says, that sends a terrible message. China seeks to present itself as playing a more positive role in global affairs to maintain peace and stability. The United States in recent days has warned Beijing there would be consequences if it supports Russia's war efforts. We're communicating directly, privately to Beijing that there will absolutely be consequences for large-scale sanctions, invasion efforts, or support to Russia to backfill them, U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said earlier this week. We will not allow that to go forward and allow there to be a lifeline to Russia from these economic sanctions from any country, anywhere in the world. A further prompt for a video entitled "China Made Huge Mistake by Not Condemning Russia's Invasion," 7 minutes and 44 seconds in duration. With the following captions, Australian ministers have warned China could be hit with economic sanctions if it chooses to directly support Russia's unprovoked invasion of Ukraine. Following on from that, Mr. Morrison said Australia would move in lockstep with its partners on any decision to impose sanctions on China. The United States has made some very clear statements about this, he said. We support those statements and we support them because we think it's important that the whole world comes together to put an end to this terrible violence and aggression by Russia and Ukraine. There is no equivalence, as China has seemed to have presented, between the claims of Ukraine and Russia. The rest of the world has not gone anywhere to suggest that. Reports emerged earlier this week that Russia has requested military aid and economic aid from China. Another accompanying video, 1 minute and 39 seconds in length, entitled "Frightening, China May Provide Russia with Economic Support." For the following captions, Sky News host Paul Murray says China will provide economic assistance to Russia at the very least. Moving along the article, they move on to read and say, I think it's very important for China to be very transparent about what it is, their relationship with Russia. What is their relationship with Russia when it comes to throwing them an economic lifeline during this global crisis, Mr. Morrison said. And potentially what, if any, support has been discussed for military support for Russia, because that would be an abomination. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, has also told China it needs to condemn Russia for its invasion on Ukraine. China should join the rest of the world in condemning strongly the brutal invasion of Ukraine by Russia, the NATO Secretary General said. China has an obligation as a member of the UN Security Council to actually support and uphold international law, and the Russian invasion of Ukraine is a blatant violation of the international law, so we call on China to clearly condemn the invasion and to not support Russia. The comments that have been generated: first up, labor China, Russia, very dangerous. There is a copy of a site. India decide importing more discounted oil from Russia to provide an alternative perspective. And Brian chimes in saying they also buy Russian armaments, yes, chilling. And Bob, whatever distracts from the government's inability to manage any issue at home, right? Based on this initial impression, I think it's pretty clear that China is constructed and represented in not only a negative manner, but also one that is potentially repulsive. And with that, we move along to the next article. This one is entitled, Former Australian Ambassador to China Jeff Raby says Beijing made huge historic mistake amid Russia's war on Ukraine. Jeff Raby, who served as Australia's ambassador to China from 2007 to 2011, described President Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine as the worst possible outcome for Beijing. This was written by Zoe Zerchak and published March 16, 2022 at 5 p.m. The article is accompanied by a video, 7 minutes and 44 seconds in duration. China made huge mistake by not condemning Russia's invasion. The opening line of this article reads, Former Australian Ambassador to China Jeff Raby has declared Beijing made a huge historic mistake in its failure to condemn Russia's war on Ukraine. Mr. Raby, who served as ambassador from 2007 to 2011, described President Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine as the worst possible outcome for China. I really think they never expected it to happen, he told Sky News Australia host Laura Jace on Wednesday. I think the Chinese leadership has made a huge historic mistake by not condemning the invasion. It's not possible in an issue like this to be as neutral as China seems to be trying to do, simply because it's a moral question of right and wrong, and clearly this is very wrong. The former diplomat said a position of neutrality, such as the one Beijing was seeking to maintain, meant you are complicit in what is a wrong act. I think they've got themselves into a terrible bind over all of this, he said. Mr. Raby believes the Chinese elite, who have the children and money overseas, absolutely fear sanctions from Western nations amid the conflict in Ukraine. There is a further video accompanying the article entitled There Must Be Consequences for Any Country Seeking to Aid Russia and Ukraine Invasion, 2 minutes and 3 seconds in duration. And following on from that, the article continues to state, China's much more deeply ingrained into international economy, the international financial system than Russia, he said. And China has spent 40 years trying to integrate itself into the global economy. It's benefited obviously from that. One wrong decision could mean much more of that effort could be lost. And that would very much be on people's minds as they look at how they respond in the next stage to this invasion. A further video accompanying the article, entitled Chilling Silence from China, is of great concern, running for 2 minutes and 37 seconds. Following up from that, the article continues to state, Mr. Raby's comments comes after the North Atlantic Treaty Organization told China it needed to condemn Russia for its invasion of Ukraine. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg suggested Beijing join the rest of the world to clearly condemn the war. The final and concluding paragraph reads, China has an obligation as a member of the UN Security Council to actually support and uphold international law, and the Russian invasion of Ukraine is a blatant violation of the international law, so we call on China to clearly condemn the invasion and not to support Russia, he said. Based on this initial impression, this is clearly a negative representation and construction of China. We move along to the next article. Published on March 17th at 11 a.m., this article has the headline, World Will Judge China for Not Taking Action Against Russia. It's accompanied with a video 6 minutes and 44 seconds in duration, and it seems like there's been a huge flurry of articles relating to China's position, dating from March 15, 16th, and running through to March 17 as well. The opening line of this article reads, Liberal Senator James Patterson says it is very disappointing China has not taken action against Russia to isolate Vladimir Putin and his kleptocrats. There's still an opportunity for them to course correct, but there's still an opportunity for them to live up to the values they espouse. And if they don't, not only the region, but the world would judge them for that. Clearly a negative construction and representation of China. With that, we'll move along to the next article. This headline reads, Global supply chains could be affected amid China COVID outbreak. It's accompanied with a video 4 minutes and 17 seconds in duration. And its opening paragraph reads, China has placed millions of citizens in lockdown to contain record outbreaks of the coronavirus. Hong Kong correspondent Britt Clannett says these are levels not seen since early 2020. The only difference is this time it's spread out across the country. 24 million people are locked down in China's Jilin province, with 60% of cases arising from this province. Cases are also rising higher in China's Silicon Valley, Shenzhen, which could also impact international manufacturing and global supply chains if lockdowns are extended. Based on this initial impression, I think this would fall within the range of somewhat negative a construction. And with that, we'll move along to the next article. This next piece relates to Taiwan. It's found in the World News section of Sky News Australia, and the headline reads, Taiwan Foreign Minister Joseph Wu says Chinese President Xi Jinping wants to change the international order. The subheader reads, Taiwanese Foreign Minister Joseph Wu says President Xi Jinping's intentions for reunification will lead China to impose their authoritarian views on Taiwan and the rest of the Indo-Pacific. This was authored by Jack Mahoney, published March 17, 2022 at 8:40 p.m. with 6 comments at this stage. The article is accompanied with a video 8 minutes and 59 seconds in duration, and it comes with the following captions. China plans to impose their authoritarian views on Taiwan and the rest of the Indo-Pacific, says Taiwan's Foreign Minister Joseph Wu. They wanted to change the international order, Dr. Wu told Sky News host Peter Kretlin. The opening line of the article reads, Taiwan's Foreign Minister Joseph Wu has issued a grave warning against China's attempts to reunify the East Asian nation. The comments come amid growing military activity near Taiwan and Chinese President Xi Jinping's intentions to reunify the two nations despite the Taiwanese resistance. Speaking exclusively to Sky News Australia host Peter Kretlin, Mr. Wu said Taiwan would continue to defend its sovereignty and democracy regardless of China's military strength. We share the fundamental values of freedom, democracy, protection of human rights, etc., and we are like-minded, he said. If you look at the ambition of the authoritarian China, they want to change the international order, they want to impose their authoritarian views on Taiwan and the rest of the Indo-Pacific. Therefore, if Taiwan falls, I'm sure the rest of the region is going to feel the impact.
Joining me now is Assistant.
For that reason alone, Taiwan must stand very strong in resisting the expansion of authoritarianism, and we will fight very hard to protect not only Taiwan's sovereignty, but also Taiwan's democratic way of life. The article continues to state, the foreign minister acknowledged the president and his officials constantly talking about reunification and said there had already been military coercion. One indicator is the air intrusion into air defense identification zones. For the last year alone, they flew almost 1,000 sorties into our ADIZ, and that is very threatening, he said. In addition, they have also naval forces that are getting very strong, and they conduct the exercises around Taiwan all the time. And in addition, they also have deployed quite a number of missiles targeted at Taiwan. In response to the military activity, Mr. Wu admitted Taiwan needed to be prepared and had begun conversations with like-minded countries about the Chinese threat and Taiwan's best defense. The way we try to do it is to make more investments in our own defense, and defending Taiwan is not just Taiwan's responsibility. The foreign minister accepted Taiwan held the responsibility to protect the Taiwanese sovereignty, democracy, and territory, adding that it had the determination to do so. Mr. Wu added the majority of the population had little interest in reunifying with the People's Republic of China, saying that more than 90% of those living in Taiwan regard themselves as Taiwanese and not Chinese. Beginning from the 1990s, as the democratic transformation in Taiwan is going on, people understand more and more that we are different from China, he said, especially when the Chinese government is trying to suffocate Taiwan internationally or try to use military coercion against Taiwan. People started to realize that we don't want to be part of the PRC. The article is accompanied with 6 comments at this stage, with one coming in from Phantom. China should note that the West's pushback against Russia is but a mere sample of the firepower it has against authoritarianism. China is so entwined into the global marketplace that any military incursion from them would be suicidal. Sic semper tyrannis, Chairman Xi. The next comment comes in from Riordan. China will impose their authoritarian views. Wow, such bad guys. We would never do such a thing here in Australia, except for the things our premiers have done in the last 2 years. Casting a mirror for reflection. An interesting comment. Beyond that, Brian comments, read communism from China. David's response to that post, 100% once true character emerges under pressure, and the whole of our country's leaders have trampled all over our freedom. The Wuza says, yes, the West has such a high moral standard, and points their finger at the likes of China, but just look at what they've done for their citizens in the last 2 years. Yes, China is more oppressive, but we are heading in that direction. Chaos responds to that comment, saying, what scares me most, Wuza, is that it appears people in our country are actually happy with that amount of control. A tide I hope it's turning, but I'm not holding my breath. Based on this initial impression, I think it's fair to say that China is constructed here in a repulsive manner. With that, we'll move along to the next piece. Found in the Global Affairs section of Sky News Australia, this next headline reads, Joe Biden to speak with Chinese President Xi Jinping about Russia's invasion into Ukraine as fears rise of military support. The subheader reads, the US President will send a clear message to his Chinese counterparts with concerns of an alignment between Beijing and the Kremlin. Written by David Wu, March 18, 2022, at 9:07 a.m. with 9 comments to date. The article is accompanied by a video 2 minutes and 22 seconds in length entitled Joe Biden Considers Vladimir Putin a War Criminal, and its captions read, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's impassioned plea for help from the United States to close its airspace has failed to convince President Joe Biden to support the fighter jets. The opening line of the article reads, US President Joe Biden will speak with Chinese leader Xi Jinping about his growing concerns over Russia's aggression in Ukraine. The White House confirmed the leader of the free world would phone his Chinese counterpart on Friday to maintain open lines of communication. The two leaders will discuss managing the competition between our two countries, as well as Russia's war against Ukraine and other issues of mutual concern, a statement read. The article is accompanied with 2 photos side by side, and the captions read, US President Joe Biden will phone Chinese leader Xi Jinping on Friday to discuss a number of issues, including the Ukraine war. And on its right, the photograph has the following captions. The White House said President Biden and President Xi would speak to maintain open lines of communication. Following on from that, the article continues to state, President Xi has yet to condemn the actions of its close ally in Russia since Vladimir Putin ordered the invasion 3 weeks ago. Beijing previously laid the blame on the US and NATO for the worsening tensions between Russia and the West, which has seen the Kremlin increase its aggression. The Biden administration raised its deep concerns earlier this week over China's relationship with Russia and fears it will provide military aid to the Kremlin. Secretary of State Antony Blinken said the president will send a clear message to President Xi to warn him from such action. President Biden will be speaking to President Xi tomorrow and will make clear that China will bear responsibility for any actions it takes to support Russia's aggression, he said, and we will not hesitate to impose costs. Mr. Blinken added it was the responsibility, I think it's a typographical error there from Sky News Australia, that was the responsibility of Beijing to defend international rules, but it appeared China was moving in the opposite direction. We're concerned that they're considering directly assisting Russia with military equipment to use in Ukraine. There's a further video accompanying the article entitled Joe Biden Announces Further Aid to Ukraine, an additional $1.1 billion of military aid to Ukraine after the country's president called on America to do more in its help to fight against Russia. Earlier this week, the article continues to state Biden's National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan met with Chinese counterpart Yang Jiechi in Rome for a summit. Mr. Sullivan warned assistance to Russia helping to avert sanctions imposed by the US or Western allies would be costly for Beijing. State Department spokesman Ned Price said Mr. Sullivan was very clear about his concerns. The National Security Advisor and our delegation raised directly and very clearly our concerns about the PRC's support to Russia in the wake of the invasion. He said the implications that any such support would have for the PRC's relationship not only with us, but also its relationships around the world. The article continues to state a report from the New York Times claimed China was approached to provide further economic help amid the ongoing sanctions imposed by dozens of countries. In a retort, Foreign Ministry spokesperson Zhao Lijian said the US was maliciously spreading disinformation targeting China and denied that there was a formal request from Moscow. On the Ukraine question, any disinformation that dismisses China's efforts misrepresents China's intention and smears China as designed to deflect the problem, stoke provocation, and profit from the issue. Based on this initial impression, I am inclined to place this in a somewhat negative manner because there seems to be a fair amount of representation from China's perspective thrown into the mix in the case of this article. We'll take a closer look by unpacking the comments section and published by Old Salty. It might be easier to persuade them if the US wasn't supplying arms to bloodthirsty tyrants themselves, not to mention wars where they directly caused mass carnage like we are seeing in Ukraine. Sanction China, Mike says. And what do you think, for example, would happen to the Australian economy if China was to impose sanctions on us? Stalin provides a comment, clarity isn't Joe's strong suit. Another comment that's come through, Biden hasn't put a single clear paragraph together since he came to office. I don't think China will be concerned. They might even get a laugh out of it. Biden's clear message to CEO Crow says, I'm your man. You have Con with the comment, hey C, don't bother picking up the phone. You know that you can't wake up people who are pretending to be asleep. With that, we'll move along to the final article from the week, dating from Monday 14th of March to Sunday 20th of March 2022, coming in from Sky News Australia. Found in the World News in China section of Sky News Australia, this headline reads, China reports first COVID-19 death in a year. It's accompanied by a video 32 seconds in duration, and the singular line in this article reads, Chinese health authorities are reporting the country's first COVID-19 death in over a year. Let's have a look and listen at the video itself then.
Chinese health authorities are reporting the country's first COVID-19 deaths in over a year. 2 people were confirmed dead on Saturday as China battles the Omicron variant. China recorded more than 2,100 new cases on Saturday. The Chinese government is pushing forward with its zero COVID strategy, enforcing strict lockdowns and mass testing. China's President Xi Jinping is suggesting the country should seek maximum effect with minimum cost in managing the latest outbreak.
Based on this initial impression, I think on the surface it seems and feels like a neutral construction, but in the grand scheme of things, when bunched together with the tonality of the articles from the week, I might also be inclined to put down a note that it could potentially be somewhat negative in construction as well. And there you go, and there you have it, a very long podcast for the week covering the 20 articles from Sky News Australia relating to China and the 20 articles from the Global Times relating to Australia. Thank you so much, and I'm appreciative of your continued support for the Australia-China Media Watch podcast. In episode 19, you're going to see massive changes and improvements to the flow of this presentation. What's essentially been happening over the last 3 months is an experiment of sorts, a project through learning by doing, by simply brute forcing, and what I think was an attempt to honestly document the news coverage from these 2 news sources. What I'm beginning to be a little bit concerned about is that the variety of it simply reads like dictation. So in episode 19, I'll be introducing a slightly different format, including data on the articles themselves, and I hope that we'll be able to provide our listeners as well as viewers a much more nuanced look at each of the articles in terms of how they were constructed and put together. Until then, I'll see you next time. This is the Australia-China Media Watch podcast, signing out.